Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The only thing I would say in relation to Tavish Scott's remarks is that I certainly never used the phrase once in a lifetime, mainly because I hope that I'm going to have quite a long lifetime yet. But beyond that, I think that it's important that we look at the genesis of today's debate and where we've got to. And I find it interesting that Lewis McDonald said that we shouldn't judge the vow on the basis of what's in the Scotland Bill. Well, if we are to take the sort of progression from the vow giving birth to the Smith Commission and the Smith Commission giving birth to the Scotland Bill, we could argue that perhaps a longer gestation period would have been more beneficial. I don't think you can rub out those very clear lines between those different processes. And indeed, today the UK Government, as my colleague Bruce Crawford has said, are again asserting that they are delivering on their promises to Scotland. I think that most objective analyses of what is before the Westminster Parliament would tend to disagree with that. And I note the comments from both the Tories and Labour about Scotland being one of the most powerful subnational legislatures. And I would point to the graph on page 26 of the unanimously agreed Devolution Committee report, which demonstrates that around 38% of the taxes raised in Scotland will be either devolved or assigned to Scotland. Comparatively, Basque and Navarre is over 50%, Quebec over 70%, and the other Canadian provinces over 60%. So I think that bears comparison when we're making those kinds of statements. I want to make some progress on the issues that I want to highlight. In terms of the issues that have been highlighted through the discussions and deliberations on the two committees that I sit on, both Finance and Devolution and Further Powers. In terms of taxation, there's a question around both the completeness in terms of the taxation elements and also the suite of taxes and the basket of taxes that are being devolved. And I note that while we are to receive powers over income tax to this Parliament, there will not be the powers over national insurance contributions, which would strike me as being something that would provide some completeness in that element. And also, although we're not being given powers over the personal allowance, we are apparently going to be in a position where a zero rate could be set, which seems to me to be a bit of a faff when essentially that is an instrument through which personal allowance alterations can take place, except for the fact that a zero rate is applicable if Scotland wishes to increase the personal allowance element beyond that which exists at Westminster. If Westminster takes a decision to increase the personal allowance in and of itself, that will have an impact on the tax income for this Parliament, and it will be interesting to see how that issue will be resolved should that decision be taken, because obviously it would have a material impact on the projections of the Scottish Government in terms of the income that would be available to it. The other issue around this is around the issue of dividend income. And I note, for example, ICAS saying that if a decision were taken in this Parliament that resulted in individuals moving income into dividends, it would reduce the tax income for this Parliament, but boost the tax income for the UK Exchequer, because they would see the benefit off of the dividend income. Again, that is an issue which I think is going to need to be examined, particularly how that would relate in terms of no detriment. In terms of the breadth of options available, both the Royal Society of Edinburgh said that they felt that the taxes being devolved were a narrower basket of taxes than is usually the case, and the Chartered Institute of Housing said that while the Scottish Government may appear to have the power to make changes to the social security system, they would lack sufficient fiscal levers to put changes into practice. I think these are comments which are worth noting. In terms of VAT, I note the Labour call for full assignment. I would caution the Labour Party on saying it will result in additional revenue, because it will result in a block grant adjustment, that assignment. So it will simply be an offset. It won't be additional revenue over and above what Scotland would receive. Absolutely. But that's why the point I made about production versus consumption is important. Because if it's attached to production, then there is an incentive in terms of boosting economic activity in Scotland, because we would then see the benefits off the back of that production. Attachment to consumption does not necessarily carry that same incentive. So if we want to see, as the Labour Party suggests, benefits through economic activity, then the attachment to production is perhaps the way that that should be pursued. In terms of the issues around borrowing in the fiscal framework, Presiding Officer, these are critical elements. I think what we need to see is some detail around what exactly the borrowing powers are going to entail. There has been talk that the borrowing powers will replace what is currently in place in this Parliament, in which case there is a question around how effective those borrowing powers can then be if they are replacing rather than supplementing what this Parliament has available to it. But there's a wider consideration here as well. The Secretary of State for Scotland came before the Devolution Further Powers Committee on the 25th of June of this year, and when he was asked about the flexibility for this Parliament within the fiscal framework, he said, "It is not the intention that the fiscal framework should constrain the powers that are being devolved in the bill." However, paragraph 2.2.5 of the command paper from the UK Government states, "In the context of Scottish devolution, the fiscal framework must ensure that Scotland contributes proportionally to the overall fiscal consolidation pursued by the UK Government." Those two statements, Presiding Officer, do not tally with one another. Either this Parliament will have flexibility, and there's a knock-on effect there in terms of the definition points around welfare, which I know some of my colleagues are going to speak about a little bit later, around flexibility. But either this Parliament will be given flexibility, which is what devolution should entail, or it will be constrained. And that will be the acid test of whether or not the fiscal framework matches the aspirations that were outlined in the vow, the Smith Commission, and are expected by the Scottish people.